Okay, let's go.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Memo, and thank you to everyone for being here this evening. Well, let's see how it goes. Okay. In the absence of... I was up until 3:45 during this talk this morning. In the absence of time travel technology, how can we ever reliably reconstruct the life appearance and behaviour of long extinct animals? In reconstructing the animals of the past, we face a kind of conflict between being appropriately conservative and appropriately speculative. Should we stick only to the stuff that we are almost certain that we've gotten right? Should we stick only to the stuff that we're very confident about? Or should we embrace the possibility of the bizarre? Should we show fossil animals as being very flamboyant? Should we show them engaging in surprising and even counterintuitive behaviours? Well, these are the key concepts that we have aimed to explore in All Yesterdays. Modern animals are frequently incredible and even ridiculous in appearance, and by this I mean that they often possess soft tissue structures that we really wouldn't predict if we only knew about these animals from their skeletal remains alone. Of course, it isn't just anatomy that's ridiculous, behaviour is as well. Now, don't get me wrong, an awful lot of animals do spend most of their time lying around, resting, eating, sleeping, resting, engaging in low-level socialising, eating, sleeping, and resting and eating. But some of them do remarkable things on occasion, and some of them do remarkable things on regular occasions. Now, if we contrast these incredible and documented bits of behaviour with the kind of stuff that's typically shown in ordinary paleoarts, well, we might well conclude that extinct animals lived lives where all they did was fight, kill and eat one another. A desire to reconstruct the animals of the past has, of course, driven generations of artists and scientists to imagine the soft tissues that once clothed the skeletons of extinct animals, in addition to speculate about lifestyles, behaviours and postures. The idea that reconstructions of extinct animals represent a blend of both verifiable facts about anatomy, proportions, paleo environments and so on, with a constrained amount of speculation is a very familiar one. But what might be surprising, what isn't well known, is that several aspects of this reconstructive process have never been well explained. This is kind of one of the dirty little secrets of paleoart. Every single researcher who wants to reconstruct a fossil animal basically has to start from scratch. There's no grand handbook of paleoart or big encyclopedia of extinct animal anatomy. Does this explain why we have such a massive leeway in how dinosaurs and other fossil animals are sometimes depicted? These illustrations are all meant to show individuals of the same single species. Well, there is, of course, some degree of slop in terms of how fossil animals can be reconstructed, but I think the main reason behind this kind of variation in reconstructions is more to do with the fact that not all restorers of extinct animals are created equal, and not all consultants and experts are created equal either. Increasingly, those of us who care are actually, complaining about the really terrible and unquestionably inaccurate reconstructions that are out there, and trying at the same time to get an increasing number of paleontologists to recognise that they really need to care about this as well. They really need to be careful in the kind of advice that they give to paleoartists. The main problem, of course, is that this all sounds good, but it's happening at the worst possible time ever in history. A demand for popular books on dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals is at an all-time high, while at the same time the ability and willingness of publishers to pay artists adequately or even at all is at an all-time low. Meaning, of course, that publishers and other companies, media-based companies, they want to use the cheapest available product. They want to prepare material in-house. This leads to poor work. It also promotes unoriginality and even copying. Now, following the lead of a predecessor is one thing, but a trend that's seen repeatedly throughout the history of paleoart is sheer unoriginality, where we see the same anatomical details, the same pieces of behaviour, the same colour schemes repeated again and again and again, sometimes over decades and sometimes even over centuries. Memes abound, whereby really similar looking animals, often strikingly odd animals that don't really look like the original fossils, these things crop up repeatedly. One of my favourites concerns the so-called freaky giraffoid rendition of the Jurassic sauropod dinosaur Barosaurus. Do I have a pointy stick? No, I don't. Okay, so starting with this 1975 misinterpretation of this 1971 illustration, we repeatedly see Barosaurus being depicted as some kind of proportionally short-tailed animal with a vertical mast-like neck. The base of the neck is shown as fantastically thick and muscular. There is some kind of soft tissue frill running down the midline of the underside of the neck, and the neck itself is often shown in an inverted U-like shape. None of these reconstructions really look much like the real Barosaurus. Barosaurus was actually a long-tailed diplodocus-like sauropod. Here's another one of these paleoart memes, this time showing the extinct flightless South American land bird Phorus racus. Phorus racus is repeatedly shown with black and white or greyish plumage and with orange and or red and yellow skin patches around about the base of the bill. The illustrations that started this meme, the ones at top left and top middle by Charles Knight and Burian, I'm pretty sure that they were inspired by comparison with living cassowaries. Living secretary birds even. Here is another one of these paleoart memes, this time showing the extinct vulturine bird Pterotornis. Pterotornis has repeatedly been illustrated as a black plumaged red-headed megavulture with a pure white woolly neck ruff. There was always something familiar about this view of Pterotornis. I could never quite put my finger on it. Now, in some cases, memes are done in homage to the efforts of predecessors, and that is the case with some of these terrestrial stalking, sauropod-eating giant Asdarchid pterosaurs. My favourite is the one at the bottom right. But in the majority of cases, these kind of memes, they represent uninformed laziness, kind of poorly researched artwork that's often done by people who don't really know anything specific about the particular animals that they're illustrating. And basically, they are often copying the work of others. Is it acceptable to work in this way? Well, it certainly doesn't show artistic ingenuity or independence. It certainly doesn't take us anywhere new. Having said that, I do of course understand that many of the people who are asked to produce these pieces of work, particularly those who are working for popular books and TV companies, I understand they often are working to crazy deadlines, and they are certainly not in it for the advancement of the field of paleoart. I also totally get the fact that they are working for peanuts. They are not getting a lot of money out of this. God knows it's hard enough to make a living in this line of work. But remember that these illustrations are meant to be checked by relevant experts. They're meant to be vetted by people who supposedly are knowledgeable about these animals. And this brings us to the fact that we do have a problem with some of the paleontologists employed as consultants. They, at least some of them, are simply not interested in the life appearance of the animals, and the end results of the kind of quotes encapsulated, the attitude encapsulated in the quotes, that these are kind of the sort of end results that we get from this attitude. So let's think for a moment about the current state of paleoart. Now, there are innovators. There are people who are working extremely hard to stay up to the minute to produce excellent and innovative work. But much mainstream work, and by mainstream work I mean stuff that appears on TV or in popular books, much of this kind of creates the impression that we're in something of a rut. Memes and tropes are universal. The same mistakes are being perpetuated by artists who don't really have access to cutting-edge information. They're not specialists. There is little incentive or effort to move beyond the sorts of reconstructions that were associated with the previous paradigm shift, that of the 1970s and 80s. There is, of course, sometimes this issue as well, as goes the supposed expert consultancy provided by some paleontologists. All yesterdays represents an effort to kind of break away, to produce something new, but not something that's new just for the sake of newness. It's new because it combines new ideas and new data with a new approach that's informed by new information from the modern world, new information from living animals. Having mentioned all of this newness, Well, we mustn't ever forget how much we owe to history, to the work and ideas of our predecessors. And an appreciation and deep knowledge of history is integral, certainly to science and to this particular kind of art. The history of paleoart is long. It extends back to the early 1800s, when people began reproducing scenes that showed Jurassic marine reptiles, pterosaurs and dinosaurs. At about the same time, there were other people depicting hypothetical human ancestors. These efforts to imagine landscapes and living creatures, they happened at about the same time as the very first attempts to reconstruct the skeletons of extinct animals, and the very first of those reconstructions was published in 1793 by Juan Bautista Bru, and it depicts the extinct sloth Megatherium. By the early 1800s, the great French pioneer of comparative anatomy, Georges Cuvier, was routinely publishing skeletal reconstructions of fossil mammals. We know that sometime around about 1808, Cuvier made the next logical step in reconstructing animals in a rigorous empirical fashion. He now began to draw soft tissue outlines around some of his skeletons, as you can see from the illustration at bottom right. But it seems that he was afraid that these soft tissue extrapolations would be regarded as too speculative, and he actually never published these reconstructions. As my colleague Scott Hartman has said, Cuvier's reconstructions look really good. They would not look out of place in a modern publication. At about the same time, we also get the very first attempts to portray the skeletal anatomy of pterosaurs. So, sorry, mistake, it should be 1812, not 1821. In 1812, Samuel von Sommering illustrated the skeletal anatomy of the Jurassic pterosaur Pterodactylus, and he illustrated a soft tissue outline around the skeleton. So this means that Cuvier's unpublished idea now became mainstream. Now, I've also included a very peculiar illustration on the slide. It represents one of the earliest attempts to depict Pterodactylus in life. It was produced in 1800. The animal is shown as a kind of furry bat-like animal, but this illustration was never published. Well, it wasn't published until 2004, so we can't say that it had any impact on the later aspects of the field. So thanks to von Sommering's 1812 reconstruction, the idea of putting a soft tissue outline around an animal now became kind of mainstream. Certainly by the 1840s, it was being widely adopted by people depicting extinct animals. The great Victorian anatomist and paleontologist Richard Owen frequently depicted fossil animals in this fashion, and indeed it was reconstructions of this sort produced under Owen's supervision that resulted in the famous Crystal Palace models built by the great zoological lecturer and artist Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins during the 1850s. Now, an evaluation of the Crystal Palace models has always been tempered by the fact that Owen's interpretations of Iguanodon, Megalosaurus and so on were inaccurate. But if we look at the models objectively, not only as efforts to depict two-dimensional drawings as three-dimensional models, but also as attempts to portray in three dimensions the anatomy of animals, they are incredibly successful. If you look at them from the right angles, many nuances of bulk, posture and anatomy are present. What's important for our story, what's especially important for our story, is that the Crystal Palace animals, the Crystal Palace models, drove an expectation among the public that fossil animals should be imagined and depicted as live creatures, even when the raw data, that's the fossil data, even when the raw data wasn't necessarily good enough for this to be allowed. Now, from what I've said so far, it might seem as if the history of paleoart kind of occurred in a bubble and that it wasn't really informed by work on other areas of the natural world. But in reality, the anatomy and observation involved in the creation of renditions of extinct animals in paleoart occurred in tandem with anatomical observations made about living animals. I mean, the scientists involved, like Cuvier and Owen, they were describing modern animals at the same time as they were describing and reconstructing those fossil ones. The artists they work with, like Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, they were masters in the painting and sculpting of live animals long before they ever tackled fossil ones. Now, this duality whereby creators of extinct animal renditions are masters in the depiction of modern animal anatomy is perhaps most famously exemplified by the American artist Charles R. Knight. Knight began working as a freelance illustrator in the 1890s. Due to both regular visits to the American Museum of Natural History in New York and to a self-taught familiarity of pig anatomy, he impressed the paleontologist Jacob Wortman, and in the 1890s Knight was commissioned to produce that reconstruction. It shows the pig-like hoofed mammal Entelodon. A career dominated by the reconstruction of extinct animals followed. Knight was the premier illustrator of fossil animals for much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And at the same time, he honed his skill at, by drawing and painting living animals. And he was a master at this, producing pieces of work that are spectacular and beautiful. Now, I believe that Knight was something of a paradox. So he promoted the idea that a detailed understanding of musculature and skeletal anatomy was required in order that an artist could bring an animal back to life. Knight's 1947 book, Animal Drawing, includes illustrations of skeletons where you see the soft tissue outline shown in silhouette around the bones. This is a style of depicting anatomy that will be very familiar to you if you know about the more recent history of paleoart. And Knight also wrote extensively about musculature and also about the poses and expressions of live animals. But the reason that I refer to Knight as a paradox is that many of his prehistoric animals, many of his dinosaurs in particular, were not reconstructed in this rigorous, anatomically informed fashion. Why? Well, it may be that it wasn't entirely Knight's fault, if you like. It wasn't his fault that he was depicting dinosaurs in this way. I mean, he was advised during much of his career by Henry Fairfield Osborn, one of the leading paleontologists of the time, and Osborn's views were very much those of mainstream, the scientific mainstream. Dinosaurs were basically big relatives of lizards and crocodiles. It was assumed that they had relatively small hind limb muscles. It was understood, or it was believed, that the bipedal species kind of walked with their backbones held diagonally and their tails being very close to, not necessarily touching, but very close to the ground. Quadrupedal species were thought to have hold their bodies in a great arched pose, with the tail coming down vertically and dragging on the ground. There was no real appreciation of the complex, ornamented shape of things like the skull of a tyrannosaur, or the skull of an allosaurus. People didn't yet understand this. So it may be that Knight was simply a product of his time. So far as he was concerned, and so far as his colleagues and peers were concerned, he was reconstructing dinosaurs in a thorough and empirical fashion. And it's only really with the benefit of hindsight that we can appreciate the inaccuracies and failings of the dinosaur depictions from this period of our understanding. And there's a really important point in here that definitely warrants further investigation. The bottom line remains, though, that Knight's reconstructions of ancient animals were so compelling, they inspired generations of later artists, and of course they continue to inspire people today. Among the many was the very prolific Czech artist Zdeněk Burian. Burian began painting dinosaurs and fossil mammals during the late 1930s, and during the next couple of decades he became internationally known as a leader in the field. His work combines incredible landscapes, an astonishing attention to texture, and a profound understanding of animal form and movement. Now, we know from illustrations like this one on the far right, we know that Burian did try sometimes to correctly portray proportions and anatomical details. What we have to remember is that he was, remarkably, he was doing these reconstructions without hardly ever seeing the fossils concerned. He was doing everything from examination of what must have been, at the time, a meagre and poorly illustrated literature. Partly due to these facts, and also to the poor state of paleontological knowledge at the time. I mean, if you're working in the 30s, 40s and 50s, there isn't much to go on. Due to these facts, his dinosaurs in particular do often look kind of poorly proportioned. Their postures aren't quite right. I appreciate that comments of this sort often sound negative, so I always have to emphasise these criticisms don't negate the quality or beauty of the artwork. I mean, Burian was clearly one of the great masters of paleoart. Same for Charles Knight. Charles Knight was also a major influence on J. Matternes, an American artist who spent decades producing brilliant renditions of living animals, as well as highly accurate, highly detailed scenes showing fossil mammals, and in particular fossil hominids. Matternes is a true anatomist artist, often working with scaled models and often applying muscles and other soft tissues made of clay before he actually begins drawing or painting. He's certainly one of the most highly regarded illustrators of fossil mammals today. Now, one of the things that really makes the illustration of fossil mammals very different from illustrating fossil dinosaurs is that there is essentially a kind of single unbroken tradition of depicting fossil mammals accurately that isn't punctuated by any major paradigm shift. But with dinosaurs, we have this major change in the way the animals have been depicted. The dinosaur renaissance of the late 1960s saw the start of a major shift in the theme of the art as well as the shape of the animals. And right from the start of the dinosaur renaissance, we see some particularly iconic dinosaur images, and in particular those produced by the famous American paleontologist Robert Bakker. Bakker's dinosaurs and other animals are shown as being highly active. They're often running. They frequently have enormously muscular hind limbs, a real contrast to the dinosaurs of Charles Knight. Their tails are often erect and shown well up off the ground. They have this very active, exciting, dynamic air about them. And we know that other people, when they first saw them, like Burian, that they were inspired to actually go back and revamp their own dinosaur illustrations. I would really love to know more about the inspirations for Bakker's particular style. We don't know much about it, it just kind of seems to come out of nowhere. We know that Bakker's reconstructions were integral to the style developed by Greg Paul. And Greg Paul was soon to become well known as the premier creator of skeletal reconstructions of dinosaurs. He also has become an internationally renowned painter and drawer of live, anatomically accurate dinosaurs. Paul's 1988 book, if you are a true nerd, you'll notice there's something weird about the cover of that copy. Paul's 1988 book, Predatory Dinosaurs of the World, includes an enormous number of rigorously posed, anatomically rigorous post-skeletal reconstructions, and Paul has continued in this tradition up to the present. We can see 2 editions there of a book that he published in 2010. What isn't as well known as it should be is that in 1987, Paul published a lengthy book chapter titled The Science and Art of Restoring the Life Appearance of Dinosaurs and Their Relatives, a Rigorous How-To Guide. Now, there are issues with some of the very confident assertions that Paul makes in his writings about behaviour, anatomy, and so on. And, of course, 1987 was a long time ago. Much has changed since then. However, this article is really significant in that it is one of the few places where a paleoartist has explained in detail how extinct animals can and should be reconstructed. And we desperately need an expanded and updated version of this kind of publication. Now, also worthy of note, of special mention rather, here is Mauricio Anton, recently described in Steve White's Dinosaur art book as the leading exponent of mammalian paleoart. Anton traces his early inspiration back to the work of Burian and others, and he is another one of these anatomist artists. He uses an anatomically rigorous approach to reconstruct Cenozoic mammals. Some of Anton's observations on anatomy and form and function have been novel, and some of them have even been integral to certain new ideas about behaviour. Some have caused a revision of ideas about the life appearance and paleobiology of certain species, and Anton has done a brilliant job of actually getting most of this work into the technical literature. Now, today, a large number of excellent artists do work hard to reconstruct dinosaurs, fossil mammals, and other extinct animals. While many of them do trace inspirations back to Knight, to Burian, also to artists of diverse genres, not just to other paleo artists, I think we can kind of say that most people working today have been most heavily influenced by Bakker, Paul, and also by Mark Hallett. Now, I haven't really mentioned Mark Hallett. He is another prominent illustrator of dinosaurs and fossil mammals. Again, he has always pointed to Charles Knight as a major source of inspiration. I also haven't mentioned Doug Henderson or William Stout. I mean, I kind of struggle to know how to put people in this sort of very loose paleo artist genealogy. Some people are going to be very offended by being left out, I'm sure. But if we can kind of generalise about the shape of the paleo artisphere as it is at the moment, I kind of would say that we're sort of living in the age of Gregory Paul, the kind of age of Paulism. That may or may not be an appealing concept. What do we actually know about the life appearance of extinct animals? Well, our knowledge is far from equal across the fossil record. And by this I mean that we know an awful lot about the life appearance of some sets of species, but we know next to nothing about certain sets of others. Now, I'm going to propose that we can group fossil animals into 3 clusters. When it comes to what we understand about their life appearance, these clusters range from the very well-known at the top to the very poorly known at the bottom. And these clusters correspond approximately to geological time, to the so-called pull of the recent, and also to the approximate phylogenetic closeness of these animals to humans and also to domestic mammals. These are the only non-human mammals for which anatomical information is accessible and well documented. So cluster number 1 contains Pleistocene and Holocene mammals, Ice Age, mammoths, rhinos, horses, bison, deer, and so on. Bodies preserved in permafrost and cave art produced by ancient people means that we have a very thorough understanding of the anatomy of these animals. In fact, some of them we understand their anatomy as well as we do animals that became extinct in historical times within the last few hundred years. The enormous amount of information that we have on recently extinct hominins like Neanderthals, Homo erectus and so on, that means that they can be included in this cluster as well. Cluster 2 contains those animals for which we have good, often fairly complete skeletons. We know or can reasonably infer the musculature. We also know at least something about the skin texture. But we're hazy on the soft tissue outlines of these animals. We're still arguing about things like neck posture, neck shape, limb configuration, the width of the body and so on. So many pre-Pleistocene fossil mammals are in this cluster, as are most Mesozoic dinosaurs, as are the majority of fossil birds, as are things like frogs, lizards, snakes, fish that are known from pretty good skeletons. The Devonian stem tetrapod Ichthyostega is in here, which kind of makes it very different from the majority of other Paleozoic tetrapods. Finally, cluster 3 contains animals where we don't have enough information to permit the creation of accurate reconstructions, as well as those where our level of knowledge is such that people have only really kind of been able to provide, they haven't been able to do much more than create a schematic outline around the bones. And unsurprisingly, the animals in this cluster tend to be poorly known. They are not especially popular research subjects among scientists, and they haven't really been illustrated all that much by paleo artists. So Mesozoic and Paleozoic things that you call amphibians, early reptiles, early relatives of mammals, many fossil sharks, they are all in this cluster. And there's a lot of work to do on these animals. The science of reconstructing these animals in particular is in its infancy. Now, our general lack of soft tissue information on the animals in clusters 2 and 3 means that they've been strongly affected by what we have come to know as shrink wrapping. Shrink wrapping is the process whereby you take the skeleton and the inferred musculature, you then put the skin on, basically you infer the minimum amount of extraneous tissue. And ever since the dinosaur renaissance, we've seen animals that are too sunken and too skeletal. the end result being kind of zombie dinosaurs, where you can see every cavity in the skull. The animal at the far right is obviously at the top is a pterosaur. You can see every cavity in the skull. You can see the outlines of the bones. Even the kind of lines, the sutures between the individual bones in the skull. But shrink wrapping of this kind is not unique to dinosaurs and pterosaurs, not unique to reptiles. It's also seen in a few mammals. A belief that some fossil mammals might have lacked many of the soft tissues present in living ones, that their underlying bony anatomy would have been more obvious than it is in living mammals, would had led to shrink-wrapped saber-toothed cats and fossil dogs. Now, more recent empirical analyses of the species concerned has shown that in life, these animals probably weren't tremendously different in appearance from their living relatives. And this work has been predominantly spearheaded by Mauricio Anton, whose name I've spelt wrong. Sorry. Mauricio Anton. This highlights how underlying bony details are typically obscured by soft tissue. Now, if any trend can be discerned from the portrayal of anatomy in paleoart, is that the pendulum has kind of swung from one extreme to another. The dinosaurs, in particular dinosaurs produced by Knight, Burian and others, they may have been anatomically accurate to a degree. They were certainly beautifully painted, but they were kind of too lumpy, too shapeless, and with inaccurately formed limbs. At the other extreme, shrink-wrapped animals are unrealistically skinny and skeletal. They have a zombie-ish quality that isn't present in living animals. And indeed, in recent years, people have increasingly noticed that living animals never look right if imagined in shrink-wrapped form. And I'm sure you'll know that this is a theme that we explore in all yesterdays. So rather than being at kind of either extreme in this spectrum, we want to be in a reasonable middle position where animals are accurately proportioned, they're anatomically accurate, and they've got a kind of correct or reasonable amount of muscle, fat, and skin. There is indeed an amount of leeway in the size, amount, and extent of muscle and fat, meaning there will always be some uncertainty over how bulky, how skinny, how muscular, how flabby fossil animals were when alive. It has recently been argued that dinosaurs should be illustrated with far fatter, far more muscular tails than shown in the artwork of people like Backer and Paul. And meanwhile, the overall skeletal anatomy of dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus allows for the possibility of lightly muscled versions as well as heavily muscled versions as well as intermediates. What about integumentary structures? What about extra flaps of skin, display structures, thick coats of feathers, fuzz covering the body, all those kinds of structures? We have to assume that these things were present in at least some fossil animals. They are widespread in living animals and they leave no obvious trace of their existence on skeletons. And I'm going to demonstrate that assertion with a very speedy run-through of images showing various birds, mammals, yeah, thank you. Crocodiles, more mammals, crocodiles, lizards. This for me is kind of the, what do you call it? The magic bullet thing, you know, the coup de grace. Look at this, look at it. Can't see the teeth. So when most people see elaborate reconstructions of sauropods like this, they either laugh or they turn away in disgust. But in view of what we've just seen in living animals, you know, maybe we should start thinking that reconstructions like this are, well, you know, maybe we've been too conservative in showing our kind of more emaciated versions of dinosaurs. Maybe reconstructions like this are, I don't want to say that they are more likely, but the point is that they are at least plausible. And therein lies the justification for the many speculative reconstructions that we have in all yesterdays. Now, if you're wondering how working scientists actually think, what they actually think about these sorts of renditions, I mean, so far the reception has been encouraging. And this is because these kind of observations fit with recent studies of dinosaur anatomy. They are increasingly showing that elaborate and often surprising soft tissue structures were present in members of diverse lineages. Facial tissues, possible balloon-like structures, frills, bristles, spines, crests along the middle of the back, fuzz, dewlaps, peculiar unexpected long tails, elaborate feathering. All these things are now known from the fossils of Mesozoic dinosaurs. So if we bring all of this together, we have what is kind of amounting to a sort of soft dinosaur revolution. That's a term that I stole from American artist Jason Broome. And similar work is happening in other branches of paleoart. You should, of course, imagine all of this happening at the same time as there is a huge surge in our understanding of paleobiology, and it's also happening at the same time as we are getting a better understanding of the behavioural and ecological complexity that's present in in animals as a whole. So, where are we now? Does all yesterdays represent some kind of watershed with respect to the maturity of paleoart? Well, I think it's clear that we need to know our history. Paleoartists need to know as much as they can about anatomy. They need to know what we do know. They also need to know what we don't know, so that we can explore those areas where there is scope and even need for speculation. We need to have some sort of better documentation of what we do know, because as I said earlier on, remember, there is a surprising absence of good texts on the techniques and history of paleoart. We need to call out bad work. We need to minimise its impact. We perhaps need to let publishers and TV companies know that it does impact, it does diminish the quality of their product. We might also need to start tackling those paleontologists who basically fail in providing the information that they're paid to. The anatomically rigorous movement that was initiated by Bakker and Paul and Matternes, it's been carried on by Hallett and Anton and many others, many contemporary artists and scientists. This needs to be supported and celebrated. We basically hope that all yesterdays inspires people to think about paleoart in a new way. There's clearly lots to think about, there's lots to argue about, and lots of this will be informed by ongoing scientific work. Can we say that all yesterdays has been a triumph? Well, I'm making a note here, huge success. It's hard to overstate my satisfaction. I really want to thank John and Memo for their innovation and their imagination. I have a long list of people who need to be thanked for various contributions to some of my ideas. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.